The blood on the marble floor didn't seem to bother him at all. Ronan Mace stood at the floor-to-ceiling window of his office on the 43rd floor, hands clasped behind his back, watching the Chicago skyline bleed orange into the horizon. Behind him, two of his men were hauling someone, out of the room with the quiet efficiency of people who'd done this many times before. The Persian rug was going to need replacing. Again, he didn't turn around. He didn't need to. "Get me a name," he said. "Whoever's been moving product through the South Side without paying tribute. I want to know by morning." The door clicked shut. Ronan Mace, 51 years old, though most people guessed younger and then immediately wished they hadn't been paying that much attention to him. He was the kind of man who made a room feel smaller just by walking into it. Not because of his height, though he had that too, but because of the particular quality of his stillness. Like a held breath, like something that hadn't decided yet whether to strike. He ran 4 legitimate businesses, 2 shell corporations, 1 very expensive law firm on retainer, and a criminal organization that stretched from Chicago's west side to the outskirts of Milwaukee. The Mace operation wasn't the biggest in the Midwest. It was simply the one nobody touched. He needed a wife. Not for love. He was 51 and had been in love exactly once, briefly, disastrously at 23, and he'd decided afterward that the feeling was simply not worth the cost. No, he needed a wife the way he needed a good accountant, functionally, specifically, and without sentiment. There was pressure from the Conti family to the east, old-world Mafia, who still believed that a man without a family at his table was a man without discipline. There was a federal investigation getting uncomfortably close to 2 of his subsidiaries. And there was his mother, but that was a separate matter entirely. His consigliere, a compact, silver-haired man named Beto, who had worked for Ronan's father before him, laid a photograph on the desk without a word. Ronan looked at it. "Her name is Penny Walsh," Beto said, 26 years old. Originally from Rockford. She's been working at the Whitmore Hotel for 3 years. Housekeeping. Before that, a diner in Wicker Park. Before that, apparently, a lot of other things. No family to speak of. No boyfriend. No social media presence worth mentioning. She owes $14,000 in medical debt from an appendix surgery 2 years ago. Ronan studied the photograph. It was a candid. She didn't know she was being photographed. She was standing at a bus stop in a grey coat, a little too thin for the November weather, holding a paper coffee cup with both hands. She was heavy-set, round-faced, with dark circles under her eyes that suggested she was working more than one job. She looked tired in the way that people looked tired when they'd been tired for so long they'd stopped noticing it. "Why her?" Ronan asked. "Because she's discreet. She's desperate enough to say yes, and she doesn't have connections to anyone in our world," Beto said. "The Contis will see a working-class wife and assume you've gone sentimental. The feds will see a domestic life and move their attention elsewhere, and she has no one who would ask questions." Ronan set the photograph down. Arrange a meeting. Penny Walsh had been vacuuming the hallway on the 38th floor of the Whitmore Hotel when the man in the charcoal suit appeared beside the service elevator and told her that someone wanted to speak with her. She'd assumed it was about the incident with the guest in 3812 who'd complained that she'd moved his laptop. She had not moved his. She had, in fact, cleaned around his laptop with the careful attention of someone who understood that her job depended on not touching guests' belongings. But guests complained, and hotels listened to guests, so Penny had set down her vacuum and followed the man in the charcoal suit. She had not been taken to the manager's office. She'd been taken to the penthouse. The man behind the desk didn't stand when she walked in, which was fine. She didn't need him to stand, but he did look at her with such complete and undivided attention that she felt momentarily like a specimen. He had dark grey hair and eyes the color of old iron and a jaw that looked like it had never done anything as undignified as smile. "Sit down, Miss Walsh," he said. She sat. He explained it to her the way he might explain a business merger, a contract. 2 years. He'd had his lawyers draft the terms already. She could review them. She was encouraged to have her own legal counsel look them over, though he suspected she didn't have legal counsel. A marriage in name only. She would live in his residence, attend social functions when required, conduct herself with appropriate discretion. In exchange, the $14,000 in medical debt cleared immediately. A salary of $8,000 a month deposited into an account in her name, full health insurance, and at the end of 2 years, a lump sum of $150,000. Penny sat very still. "You're serious," she said. "I don't make social calls, Miss Walsh." She looked around the penthouse. There was a painting on the wall that probably cost more than her apartment building. There was a Scotch glass on the desk, half empty, and no visible source of music, but something quiet and string-heavy was coming from somewhere. The man across from her, Ronan Mace, Beto had said his name was on the elevator up, with the specific tone of someone conveying information they considered important, was watching her with the patience of someone who had already decided how this would end. "What happens if I say no?" she asked. "You go back to work," he said. "Nothing else." She thought about the $14,000. She thought about the letter from the collections agency that had arrived last Tuesday, the one she'd put face down on her kitchen table and not turned back over. She thought about her feet, which ached in a way that had become so constant she'd stopped separating it from her baseline experience of existing. "I want it in writing," she said. "All of it." Something shifted in his expression, so slight she almost missed it. "It already is," he said. They were married 6 weeks later in a civil ceremony with Beto and one of Ronan's attorneys as witnesses. Penny wore a navy dress she'd bought at Macy's with her first month's advance. Ronan wore a suit that probably had its own name. The whole thing took 11 minutes. She moved into his house on the North Shore that same evening. A house was not quite the right word for it, but she didn't have a better one. It had 14 rooms that she knew of, and probably more that she didn't. There was a housekeeper named Mrs. Parrott, who showed Penny to her room without commentary, and a cook named Dell who asked without warmth, but also without hostility, whether she had any dietary restrictions. "No," Penny said, and then, because she was already thinking about what the next 2 years were going to feel like, "I'm not picky. Whatever's easy." Dell looked at her for a moment. "The boss eats at 7, she said. "I'll set 2 places." Ronan was not unkind to her. This was the thing she kept turning over in those first weeks, the thing that didn't fit the shape she'd expected. He wasn't warm. Warmth didn't seem to be part of his vocabulary, but he was never cruel, never dismissive, never looked at her the way some men looked at her, with that particular sliding away of the eyes that said too much, too visible, take up less space. He looked at her directly when she spoke. He asked at the first dinner whether she preferred sparkling or still water, and when she said still water appeared at every subsequent meal without her having to ask again. She learned his patterns. He was up by 5 and in his study by 5:30. He drank his coffee black and had it with exactly 1 piece of toast. He didn't watch television, but he read constantly. History, mostly, biographies of dead generals and failed empires. He worked late and came to dinner with the specific quality of someone setting down a very heavy object they'd been carrying all day. He was not what she'd expected. She wasn't sure what she'd expected. Someone worse, maybe. There was a dinner, 2 months in, for the Conti family. Penny had been briefed by Beto with the thoroughness of a military operation. The Contis were old money, old blood, old rules. The patriarch, Aurelio's cousin, a man named... She'd been told his name, but now, standing in the receiving line in a green gown that Ronan's stylist had selected for her, she couldn't recall it. What she recalled was the instruction, smile, say little, do not discuss business, do not discuss the nature of your relationship with Ronan, "Do not drink more than 1 glass of wine." Ronan appeared beside her with the quiet materialization of someone who'd been watching from across the room. "The green suits you," he said, very low. Not quite a compliment, but something adjacent to one. She didn't know what to do with that, so she said, "Beto told me to wear something conservative. Beto has terrible taste," Ronan said. "You look fine." The evening went the way those evenings went. There was a man, younger than Ronan, louder, the kind of handsome that knew it was handsome, who was introduced as Marcus Conti, nephew of the patriarch, visiting from New York. He shook Penny's hand and held it a beat too long and looked at her in a way that had nothing to do with respect. "So you're the famous Mrs. Mace," he said. "I don't know about famous," Penny said. "Ronan's very private," Marcus said, with a smile that was clearly practiced. "We've been trying to get him to bring you out for months." "I can see why he kept you hidden." It was the kind of remark that was supposed to be a compliment and wasn't. Penny had been receiving remarks like that her entire life, the ones that pretended to be admiring while actually being an assessment, a cataloguing of what was wrong with the picture. She smiled anyway. Ronan was 3 feet away, talking to someone else. She didn't think he'd heard. Later, on the drive home, he said, "Marcus Conti has bad manners." "I've dealt with worse," she said. He looked at her. In the dark of the car, his face was mostly shadow. "I don't doubt that," he said, and his voice had something in it she hadn't heard before. Something that sounded almost like anger, but directed at the wrong target. Not at her, but on her behalf. She turned and looked out the window. It was a Tuesday in April when Penny came home to find the house on the North Shore locked from the inside and 3 unfamiliar cars in the driveway. She'd been at the grocery store. Ronan had a cook, but Penny had taken to doing her own shopping on Tuesdays, not because she was required to, but because it was something she'd always done, and she needed something that was still entirely hers. She had 4 bags of groceries and her keys in her hand, and the front door that should have opened with her key did not open. She heard something from inside the house. Not voices. Impact. She had her phone halfway out of her pocket when the door opened from the inside, and a man she'd never seen grabbed her arm and pulled her in. Ronan was in a meeting on the 39th floor of his building downtown when his phone lit up with a call from Dell. Dell never called him. He was out of his chair before he'd consciously decided to move. Beto looked up from across the table with the expression of a man who had been watching Ronan Mace for 30 years and knew exactly what that speed meant. "Get everyone," Ronan said. That was all. Beto was already on the phone. The call had been brief. Dell had been in the kitchen when they came in. She'd heard Penny arrive, heard the door, heard her voice. "What's going on? Who are you?" And then nothing. By the time Dell reached the hallway, Penny was gone. 3 men, a black SUV, no plates Dell could read from the window. Ronan sat at the back of his car and felt something he didn't have immediate language for. He'd had people taken before. Members of his organization, occasionally leverage used against him by competitors. He knew the choreography. You gathered information, you made contact, you negotiated or you didn't. You resolved the situation. This was different. He didn't examine why it was different. He didn't have time. "Marcus Conti," Beto said from the front seat. Ronan looked at him. "The house cameras. 2 of the 3 cars are registered to shell companies that trace back to a Conti-held property in Cicero." Beto paused. "This was a message. Find out what the message says," Ronan said. "And then find my wife." He'd never called her that before. Not naturally, not without the performance of it. It came out of his mouth without calculation and sat in the silence of the car. And neither he nor Beto commented on it. Penny was zip-tied to a chair in what appeared to be a warehouse somewhere south of the city. She could tell it was south by the quality of the light coming through the high, narrow windows. She'd grown up in this part of the city. She knew what southern Chicago light looked like in April. The man they'd left to watch her was leaning against the wall across the room, arms crossed, not looking at her. There were 2 others. who came and went. Nobody had hurt her. Nobody had explained anything. She thought about being afraid. She was afraid, technically. Her heart rate was wrong and her hands were cold, and she had the specific focus of someone who was preventing themselves from thinking too much by thinking about immediate, practical things. The zip tie was on her wrists in front of her, not behind, an amateur mistake. Her ankles were tied to the chair legs with rope, not zip ties. She thought about Ronan. Not in a romantic way, she told herself. In a practical way, he would look for her. Not because he cared, their agreement was clear, 2 years, no sentiment, but because having his wife taken was a statement, and Ronan Mace did not let statements go unanswered. She thought, for reasons she couldn't entirely account for, about the way he'd said, "I don't doubt that," in the car, the way he'd looked at her. A man walked in. Not one of the watchers, someone different. He was wearing a good suit, and he had the walk of someone who expected people to look at him when he entered rooms. He was maybe 40, hair slicked back, a ring on his right hand that he kept turning. "Mrs. Mace," he said, and he smiled. "Do you know what you're worth? Less than you think," Penny said. He laughed, which surprised her. He always picks the interesting ones. He crouched down to look at her at eye level, which she found patronizing. "We want to have a conversation with your husband. That's all this is. You're just a tool he'll come looking for," she said. "That's the idea." She held his gaze. "You should know," she said, "that whatever you think you know about Ronan Mace, whatever you've heard, it's less than the truth." He smiled again, looser this time, like she'd said something he found mildly funny. "We'll see." He stood and walked back out. The watcher resumed leaning against the wall. Penny went back to looking at the window and thinking about practical things. They found the warehouse at 11:17 p.m. Ronan knew it was the right one because 2 of the Conti cars were parked outside, and because Beto's man on the inside, everyone had men on the inside. This was the oldest rule in the business, had confirmed the location 2 hours ago. What Ronan had not confirmed was how many were in the building, where inside the building, and what condition Penny was in. He didn't wait for a full confirmation. This was not like him. He was methodical. He was patient in a way that people in his line of work frequently mistook for coldness. He'd built everything he had on the principle that you didn't move until you knew what you were moving into. He moved anyway. There were 6 of Conti's men in the warehouse. There were 11 of Ronan's. He didn't remember the specifics of the next 4 minutes with any clarity. He remembered the layout of the building: concrete floor, high ceilings, industrial shelving along the eastern wall, 2 interior doors. He remembered the sound. He remembered that the man who had been left to watch Penny raised his hands when Ronan came through the door, which was the right decision, and that Ronan looked at him for exactly 1 second before deciding to let someone else deal with him. He found her in the back room. She was in the chair, zip-tied. 1 piece of hair escaped from her ponytail and sticking to her cheek, and she was looking at him with an expression he couldn't categorize because he'd never seen it directed at him before. Like she'd known he was coming. Like she'd never considered the possibility that he wouldn't. He crossed the room and crouched in front of her and cut the zip ties himself. He had a knife on him. He always had a knife on him. Her wrists were red. He looked at them and felt something tighten in his chest that had no place in a concrete warehouse in the middle of an extraction operation. "You're late," she said. He looked up at her. "It's after 11, she said, and then, with the specific tone of someone who has been holding themselves together for hours and is now deliberately choosing to continue holding. "I missed dinner. Dell will make something," he said. His voice came out strange. He helped her stand. She was steady on her feet, steadier than he'd expected, and she held his arm only for a moment before releasing it and proving she didn't need to. He kept his hand at the small of her back anyway. They walked out through the warehouse, through what remained of the scene, and Penny looked straight ahead and didn't flinch once. In the car, she was quiet for a long time. Then she said, He turned a ring on his right hand. Nervous habit. He seemed confident, but his left knee was bouncing the whole time he was crouching. She paused. I don't know if that's useful. Ronan looked at her. That's Marcus Conti's second, Beto said from the front, and his voice had a quality that Ronan recognized as the sound of someone revising an opinion. I know, Penny said. I recognize the ring. Aurelio's family uses a specific signet. She said it simply, factually, like someone identifying a bird species. I read about it in one of the books on the shelves in the study. There's a whole chapter on symbolic artifacts in organized crime families. I hope that's okay. A silence. You read the books in my study, Ronan said. There's not much else to do on weeknights, she said. Marcus Conti made contact the following morning. Ronan took the call in his study, standing by the window, and Penny sat in the kitchen with Dell and drank coffee and did not try to listen, because she'd already decided that whatever happened next was Ronan's to manage, and she was not going to pretend it was otherwise. Dell set a plate of toast in front of her, without being asked. He'll fix it, Dell said, which was not Dell's usual register, but seemed to be what the moment required. I know, Penny said. She meant it. She wasn't sure when she'd arrived at knowing it. Sometime in the warehouse, maybe. Sometime in the space between zip ties and car doors, when she'd had nothing to do but think about the shape of the 2 years she'd been living in and realize they'd taken on a different texture than she'd expected. She was not in love with Ronan Mace. She was not going to make that mistake. But she had, somewhere in the slow accumulation of still water and 7 a.m. dinners and books about dead generals, begun to trust him, and trust was not a thing Penny Walsh gave away easily or lightly. The $14,000 had bought her presence. It had not bought that. Ronan appeared in the kitchen doorway. Dell immediately found somewhere else to be. He stood in the doorway for a moment in the way he sometimes stood in rooms, like a man who had something to say and was deciding how to say it, which was unusual for him, because Ronan Mace almost always knew exactly how to say things. It was one of the qualities that made him frightening. The Countess will pull back, he said. Marcus overstepped his authority. The patriarch, he paused, displeased. It won't happen again. Okay, Penny said. Your wrists, they're fine. They were bruised faintly. She'd put arnica on them. He moved to the kitchen table and sat down across from her, which was not something he typically did. He was a man who ate at a formally set table and worked at a desk and occupied spaces with specific intentionality. Sitting down at the kitchen table, across from his contractual wife and her half-eaten toast, was not a space he'd occupied before. He looked at her hands. I need to tell you something, he said. She waited. The contract. He said it like the word cost something. The 2-year arrangement, the terms we agreed to. I remember them, she said. I want to renegotiate. The kitchen was very quiet. Somewhere in the house, a clock was doing what clocks did. Renegotiate to what? Penny asked. He was not a man who looked uncertain. He was not a man who had expressions that read as uncertainty. And yet there was something in the line of his jaw, in the particular stillness of his hands on the table, that she'd learned to read over the past months as the textures of something he hadn't yet figured out how to say. To something longer, he said, to something real. She looked at him across the kitchen table in the ordinary morning light, with his coffee going cold and her half-eaten toast between them. You should know, she said carefully, that I'm not going to be a different person because you decide you want this to be real. I'm still going to be, she gestured at herself, a small motion that encompassed everything. Penny Walsh from Rockford, 260 pounds. Bad knees, $14,000 of medical debt that had already been paid, but that she still thought about. This, I'm aware, he said, and you still want to renegotiate, yes. She looked at him for a long moment. Then I have conditions, she said. Something moved across his face. If she'd had to name it, she might have called it relief. Write them down, he said. I'll have the lawyers. No lawyers, she said. Just us. This part is just us." He nodded. She pulled the paper napkin from under her coffee cup and found a pen in the junk drawer that everyone apparently had even in 14-room mansions, and she smoothed the napkin flat on the table between them and wrote her conditions in her own handwriting. She wrote 3 things. She slid the napkin across the table. He read it. She watched him read it. When he looked up, the thing on his face was not like anything she'd seen from him before, and she'd been watching him for 8 months and paying attention the way she'd learned to pay attention to things she couldn't afford to misread. It was the expression of a man who'd been carrying something heavy for a very long time and had just, in a kitchen, over cold coffee and half-eaten toast, been offered somewhere to set it down. "Done," he said. The attorneys, when they were eventually involved, were baffled by the napkin. Ronan kept it anyway. It went into his desk drawer, in the back, behind the things that were important. She found out about this later, through Dell, who found out about most things. The wedding, the real one, the second one, was small. Penny wore the navy dress again, because she liked it, and because she decided she didn't have to have opinions about wearing dresses twice. Ronan didn't comment on it. He did, when he saw her come down the stairs, go very still in the way he sometimes went still when he was deciding something. "You look," he started. "Don't say fines," she said. A pause. Something happened at the corner of his mouth. "Beautiful," he said, like it was the only accurate word available. She held onto the railing and didn't say anything, because there was nothing to say to that wouldn't have ruined it. 7 months later, Dell called Beto with the news because she called Beto with everything, and Beto walked into Ronan's office and set a small pharmacy bag on the desk without explanation, and Ronan looked at the bag and then at Beto, and Beto said nothing, and Ronan looked at the bag again. "Where is she?" he asked. "Kitchen," Beto said. Ronan was out of his chair. Penny was sitting at the kitchen table. Their kitchen table. She'd started thinking of it as that sometime in the preceding months, with a cup of tea and the expression of someone who had recently received information and was still integrating it. She looked up when he came in. "Dell has terrible boundaries," she said. "Dell has been with this family for 22 years, he said. "She has exactly the right boundaries." He sat down across from her. His hands on the table were very still. She looked at her. "Ronan," she said. "Penny," he said. She stopped. Started again. This was not in either version of the contract. "No," he agreed. "It changes things. Everything." The way he said it. Everything. Like it was not a complication, not a problem to be solved, not a variable to be managed. Like it was simply the truest thing in the room. She felt the back of her throat go tight in the way that happened when she was trying not to feel things too completely, too fast, before she could be sure they were safe to feel. He reached across the table and covered her hand with his. He didn't say anything else. He didn't need to. Ronan Mace, who had built an empire on saying exactly the right thing at exactly the right time, seemed to have decided that this was a moment that didn't need language. Outside, Chicago was doing what Chicago did in November, going gray and cold and magnificent, the lake somewhere beyond the tree line, the whole city carrying on with the specific indifference of very large things. Inside, in the kitchen, Penny Walsh. Penny Mace now, though she was still getting used to that, still trying on the weight of it. Sat across the table from the man who had turned out to be nothing like she'd expected, and felt, for the first time in a very long time, like the math of her life was adding up to something she actually wanted to keep.